So here we are, guys, in the final lecture of AP World History. We're going to talk about key concept 6.3, and we are going to wrap this up with one tiny bow from one corner of the globe that has been a star of the story from the beginning of world history until today. So we will get us to that point. We're going to talk about how nations reacted to economic pressures of the 20th century today. We're going to talk about how nations work to deal with political issues and issues of security in the advent of disastrous global conflicts. We'll talk about that today. We are going to talk about how people would gain some new views of the society and the culture that they live in, and ultimately wrap it up with the idea of a new global culture being created, which we are now all firmly part of, and we live it, so we don't need to spend too much time talking about it. But first, let's head way back into the beginning of the 20th century and talk about how some countries handled economic pressures within their nation. And we're going to start with talking about communism. Now, we've already mentioned this in light of the Cold War. You should have an understanding, like when you hear communism, when you hear the word communism, you should associate it with a government control, guys, quiet please, a strict government control of the means of production of a society. The government controls the economy, all right? And there's two countries that highlight this in the 20th century. First, the Soviet Union, and second, China. But we'll talk about the Soviet Union first because they were the first communist power in the world. They evolved into a communist power through the disaster that World War I was for Russia. As we already spoke about, World War I leads to the end of the Tsar in Russia, the end of the Russian Empire. And the revolution and civil war that follows World War I for Russia leaves Russia with a communist leadership in a guy named Vladimir Lenin. Now, Vladimir Lenin, as the first leader of the Soviet Union, took some baby steps in turning the Soviet Union into a communist state. If you remember me mentioning back maybe a couple months ago when we first started talking about Marxism, Karl Marx spoke about like an evolution of the world, like from where it used to be landowner and his slaves, and then that progressed to business owner and his impoverished workers, and then the final step was going to be this communist utopia, where the goods of production of a society would be shared by all. Problem is the Soviet Union missed out on that second rung of the ladder, okay? They had landowners and the slaves. In Russia, we called them serfs. They had their serfs and their landowners, but then they really missed out on the capitalist middle, right? They never had their large capitalist middle class arise in Russia. Lenin had, in the initial years of the Soviet Union, he wanted to push the Soviet Union towards a communist world, but it was going to take time. After Lenin died, and when Joseph Stalin took over in the Soviet Union in the late 1920s, Stalin moved to accelerate the push towards a true communist ideal economy. And he did that through a series of what he called 5-year plans. They are what they say they are, guys. They are economic programs with strong goals to increase manufacturing output within 5 years. And so the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin would institute these 5-year plans with goals at the end of the 5 years. And then once you get there, what do? You create a new 5-year plan. Where are we going to be 5 years from now? And then you get there and you create a new 5-year plan. And it all involved increasing industrial output for the Soviet Union, increasing agricultural output for the Soviet Union with strong government control. All right? You want to recognize a couple things about the Soviet Union as compared to the United States, because today we know how the story ends. We know how the strict government-controlled economy doesn't really function all that well, right? As evidenced by like the couple like happier communist countries in the world today, when we look at North Korea certainly, when we look at Cuba, when we look at Venezuela, that these are countries that their economies are in deep depression and they are slow to react to economic pressures, all right? But in the 1920s or late 20s and into the 30s, 40s, 50s, the jury was out still. There was no consensus as to which economic system was ultimately going to win the day. For example, in the 1930s, what is the capitalist system of the United States and Western Europe going through? The Great Depression. It was a disaster. It was an absolute failure of a capitalist economy, right? But in the Soviet Union, they avoided a lot of the worst of the Great Depression because they weren't nearly as involved in global trade like the United States was. So the Soviet Union was able to avoid that and experience a lot of economic growth in the 1930s, all right? Same thing after World War II. The United States has got a little bit of an economic boom after World War II, but so does Russia. So does the Soviet Union. So even by the 1950s, there's a lot of debates, legitimate debates, as to which system was going to work better. Today, I think we've answered that question, but in the 20th century, the jury was still out on that question. Now, China becomes a communist country in 1949 with the victory of a man named Mao Zedong and his communists. Mao, M-A-O. You can just call him Mao. Remember, in Chinese names, the first name we read is the family name. All right? So it's appropriate to call Stalin, Stalin. It's appropriate to call Mao Zedong, Mao. All right? So Mao is the leader of Chinese communism. He's the leader of the Communist Party in China. And when China becomes, in 1949, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, that's Communist China, Mao will work to quickly revolutionize Chinese industry. Because remember, China missed out on a lot of the industrialization of the 19th and early 20th century. Mao wanted to put China on the industrial map. And he's going to do that beginning in 1958 and 59 with what he called China's Great Leap Forward. And here's some Chinese propaganda with Mao in the lead, leading Chinese industrial and agricultural workers to the progress of the future. All right? The reality of, what's that? This guy? Oh, that guy here? Oh, I didn't even notice him. Yes. Oh, really? Yes, there we go. How did I miss that guy?
He's just riding some nukes.
That's wild, yeah.
Propaganda, guys.
All right. This is more the reality of what the Great Leap Forward would have looked like. One program within China's Great Leap Forward, this dramatic push by the Chinese government to revolutionize Chinese industry, was to use China's greatest asset in order to industrialize. And that would be the massive population of China. It was always and still is today the biggest population in the world. China was going to use its population. The mass of them are peasants. China is going to use its peasant population to industrialize with the construction of hundreds of thousands of these backyard furnaces. All right? Literally furnaces in people's villages, in what would ultimately be their backyards where they lived, where every single Chinese citizen was put to the task of producing steel for the Chinese state. Because what better way to show the world that you are an industrial powerhouse and that your economic ideas will work and are superior to all others than by showing the United States or showing the Soviet Union or any other country in the world that you can produce more steel than they can. And in the 1950s, the United States was the leading steel-producing nation of the world. Well, China was going to catch up to them through the Great Leap Forward. And the Chinese government would issue harsh quotas. We know what a quota is, right? It's like $0.25, right? Ah, that's a good, that's an oldie but a goodie, right? Quota? It's kind of like a quarter? No. Okay, we know what a quota is, right? The government tells you you need to produce this much stuff. And if you don't produce this much, there could be some kind of punishment that you are dealt, all right? So Chinese citizens were issued quotas for production. Unfortunately, you need natural resources in order to produce steel, right? Like, what are the two main natural resources one needs to produce steel?
Carbon iron.
What's that?
Carbon and iron.
Yeah, but usually we don't get carbon in carbon. Well, like, where do we get the carbon from? Yeah, okay, so you burn coal, very good, which is going to fire these furnaces, and then you heat that iron to get out the impurities within it, and it's going to make it stronger. Now, by the time the Chinese are doing this to make steel in their backyards, how are Western Europeans and Americans making steel? In modern factories using modern processes like the Bessemer process and whatnot. All right? We're using modern industrial technology. China is trying to figure it on their own and having just peasants do it. And where will Chinese peasants get this iron from? Okay, some of it might be mined, but there's not iron mines throughout China.
The government will give it to them.
You know, if I were to force all of you to come up with some iron today, where would you come up with iron? Okay, you could maybe import it from outside, but that, you know, if all you can do to produce your own industry is to import stuff from outside, that doesn't mean you're that strong. Yeah. Utilize what's already there. What's already there? Where do you have iron? Where? You can scavenge, okay. Yeah? Your pots and pans. People are cooking with my favorite utensil in my kitchen is my big iron skillet. Got it for Christmas last year, and it makes me so excited. It's the best thing ever. I love my iron skillet. Well, millions of Chinese, in order to meet their quotas, were forced to use their tools and their cooking implements in order to smelt them into steel. Now, what happens when millions of Chinese start to use their cooking implements and their agricultural tools to turn into steel for the state? Well, now they can't cook. They can't raise their food. Because these people still had to grow their food. They're spending so much time and energy on industrial production and their resources on industrial production that now they can't farm like they used to. And the Great Leap Forward will be an absolute disaster for China. Millions of Chinese. It's hard to come to an exact number, but some put the number as high as like 30 million or more Chinese will die of a famine in the early 1960s, in due large part to the disastrous economic policies of the Great Leap Forward. And then the steel that they did produce, the quality was horrid. It was useless steel. It was nothing in comparison to what was being produced in the Soviet Union or in Western Europe or the United States. So these Chinese people were putting their lives on the line, and many of them ultimately dying to produce useless scrap that couldn't be used. This was in the early 1960s. And to add insult to injury, Mao Zedong didn't want the world to know that this was such a great disaster. So even while his own people were starving and dying, China continued to export rice out of the country. Because that would show that China was an economic powerhouse if they were still an exporting nation, if they were still taking what they produced and sent it outwards, so they could show the world that good stuff is made in China, even while millions of Chinese are dying. Yeah? Yeah, or sprint backwards. So this is China's plan. Then we talked about the 5-year plans of the Soviet Union. You've got now in your arsenal a couple of examples of communist governments taking complete control of their economy, and for China at least, the effects of that. Now, for the United States, the 20th century brings some economic change, right? And we remember in the late 1920s, we have the Great Depression, the onset of the Great Depression, right? Where the most disastrous economic crisis in American history will unfurl itself. And the president of the time of the beginning of the Great Depression, you guys know from AP US history last year, is Herbert Hoover. A lot of people just think about Roosevelt. He didn't come in until the Depression was a few years old. Herbert Hoover was the President of the United States. And you remember that our initial reaction to solving the problems of the Great Depression was to be more protectionist, to increase tariffs, to try to protect American businesses. Well, in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt will be elected President of the United States, and he will quickly usher in a program that they call the nude eel. And that's why I've put a picture of an unclothed eel. I'm bringing out all my good ones, guys. No, it's not a nude eel. It's the New Deal. It's the New Deal. Yeah. Hey, we're going out strong. We're going out strong, right? All right. Oh. Not a nude eel, but a New Deal. And this was Franklin Roosevelt's collection of programs, economic programs, that were meant to bring the United States out of the depths of the Depression. All right? For AP World, for AP US, you guys learned all about the alphabet soup of the New Deal, right? The NRA and the CCC and the AAA and the WPA and all the rest. We don't care about those in AP World. Here's what we care about. The New Deal in the United States and also reactions that we're going to see in Western Europe are going to take federal governments that previously didn't have a lot to do with the national economy, all right? Like the federal government before the New Deal was relatively small, insignificant. It didn't affect everyday people's lives very much. After the New Deal, the federal government in the United States, at least, and other European nations that employ similar programs, the federal government will be, for many Americans, the most important level of government in their lives. For example, if you are an older American receiving Social Security payments, right? Old age insurance in the United States. If you are an American receiving Social Security payments, you absolutely care that the federal government is taking care of your economic well-being. Now, yes, you paid into Social Security, yes, but you are going to get far more out of Social Security than you paid in. Well, maybe not you guys. It's all going to be gone by the time you're old. But maybe me, and certainly your grandparents. So what do we need to know about the New Deal and the Great Depression and the impacts of it? It's going to take the United States and other European nations to have their governments also start to take more control over the economy. It gives people in capitalist societies the notion that maybe the system doesn't work best and maybe the government has to take a much greater role in the economic well-being of a state. We see this in the United States with the New Deal. We are going to see this in Europe, in two countries in particular, in Italy and in Germany, with the growth of what's known as fascist corporatism. Corporatism, as seen in these fascist countries like Germany and like Italy. Remember, the Nazi Party, if you're familiar with it at all, the Nazi Party in Germany is the National Socialist Workers' Party. It's got that word socialist in there. National Socialism, yes. But it's got that word socialist in there. And Benito Mussolini, the founder of fascism, before he founded and became a fascist, he founded the Fascist Party in Italy. Before he was that, guess what he was? He was a socialist in Italy. He was a member of the Socialist Party in Italy. So these fascist governments, we often think of them as far right-wing governments, but economically speaking, they themselves took a lot of control over their own nation's economies. It's often said about Benito Mussolini, yeah, he did a lot of rotten things, but he made the trains run on time. Well, in his fascist government, he would have government bodies, bureaucrats, orchestrating sectors of the economy. This is what corporatism is, where the government doesn't necessarily own the businesses, but the government certainly oversees various sectors of the economy, whether they be transportation sectors or energy sectors or manufacturing sectors. The government is deeply involved in the oversight of the sector, not individual businesses within, but in guiding what the sector is going to be doing, the bigger group of companies. Cool? Cool. So the Great Depression makes some countries push more towards government control of their economies. We're going to see something similar after World War II. There's Gamal Abdel Nasser waving at you guys. He was the president of Egypt in the early 50s and into the 60s. After World War II, we talked about a number of countries around the world becoming independent, right? Britain and France couldn't afford or couldn't subdue their colonies anymore. And so we start to see South Asia and Southeast Asia and Africa gain their independence. In many of these nations, their new governments would take strong control over the economic well-being of the state. And so we would see communist governments, or communism, have a strong appeal in many of these newly independent states. We would have a leader in Egypt like Gamal Abdel Nasser, N-A-S-S-E-R, Nasser in Egypt, who will look inside Egypt and say, we should be self-sufficient. We shouldn't rely on foreign powers and foreign economies for our own well-being. And for example, in the 1950s, Nasser will nationalize the Suez Canal in Egypt. The Suez Canal was constructed by Europeans and owned by a French company. So the wealth of the Suez Canal was like leaving Egypt to go to French investors. Nasser took it over. He nationalized the Suez Canal. Egyptian resources for Egyptian people. In East Asia, new governments in East Asia, especially in countries like Japan and South Korea, countries that are going to be known as the Asian tigers, these strong economies in Southeast Asia or in East Asia. Vietnam will eventually hop into the club. Vietnam will eventually hop into the club. Will have their governments direct their economies to becoming powerful export economies, manufacturing economies that will export to the outside world. And we see this most clearly with the auto industry. Raise your hand if your parents have a Honda in the driveway. There's one. Raise your hand if your parents have a Toyota in the driveway. There you go. Raise your hand if the parents have a Hyundai or a Kia in the driveway. So there's Japanese cars, there's Korean cars, all right? By the late 20th century, though, we start to see a reaction to this. And we are still living in the time where we are reacting to this growth of centralized economies, guys. You heard in recent years a lot about Greece and the poor economic conditions of Greece, I'm sure, right? One of the issues in Greece and that many other European nations are dealing with is that their governments created such a strong social safety net, welfare programs, government spending in their countries that was so big that eventually the economy couldn't sustain it anymore. And the governments had to start reining some of that in, all right? The government started to have to draw back on that. The United States began that push in the 1980s with this president, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980, becomes president in 1981. Ronald Reagan maybe today is most famous, and this is certainly trumpeted a lot by the Republican right today, with this quote. In the present economic crisis that he's entering into of the 1970s, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Please recognize the dramatic change in that philosophy from 1930s New Deal beliefs of Franklin Roosevelt to 1980s, what it becomes known as Reaganomics. The shrinking of the federal government, at least in terms of the federal government's control of the economy. Now, at the same time that Ronald Reagan will be shrinking the size of the federal government's control over the economy, he's absolutely growing the military, and that goes to the Cold War story. He's going to increase spending on our military, which is one key to the puzzle that unlocks the end of the Cold War. But for Ronald Reagan, this retraction from the federal government in the economy comes in two forms. First, lowering taxes. Ronald Reagan lowered taxes across the board. When Ronald Reagan came into office, the wealthiest Americans were paying more than 70% of their highest earnings to the federal government. Now, time out for a second. That doesn't mean they're paying 70% of all their earnings. In America, we have what we call a graduated income tax schedule. So the more money you make, every additional dollar you make, you might step into a higher, what we call tax bracket. Every American, from me to you guys if you have a job, to Bill Gates, on our first, like say $10,000 of income, we all pay the exact same. And then on our next chunk of money, the people that make more pay a higher percentage. On the next chunk of money, you pay more. So if you were to ask me, Mr. Dobie, what is your marginal tax rate? What that means is, what taxes am I going to pay on like the last dollars that I earn every year? All right?
My marginal tax rate is 28%. Me and my wife, we earn enough money that puts us into the 28% tax bracket. That doesn't mean I pay 28% of my income into taxes, because I didn't pay 28% on all my first dollars. And then there's all kinds of deductions and credits, which gets us into the weeds of American tax policy, which we don't need to talk about. My effective tax rate, what I actually paid, is closer to like 12% for federal income taxes. It's not as big. What Ronald Reagan did is he wanted to lower all of those tax rates. Lower the highest ones, lower the middle ones, lower the lower ones. But he dramatically lowered the higher ones. We went from a marginal tax rate, a top tax bracket for the highest earners in America that was over 70%. And even that was low compared to what it was earlier in the 20th century. I'm going to blow your minds right now. You ready for this? During the height of the Great Depression and the Second World War, the American highest marginal tax rate was over 90%. Luke, that makes your mind want to explode, doesn't it? It does. I know it does. I know it does. All right? That would be lowered under Eisenhower, and that would be later lowered further under Nixon and then into Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan brought it down to about 40%. All right? Today, some people think that is still way too high. If you remember something called the Bush tax cuts that you probably heard a little bit about, or at least you heard it talked about in later elections. George W. Bush lowered all the tax rates again, and he went down to around 34%, 35% for that highest marginal tax rate. And then the Bush tax cuts expired, and those tax rates went back up, right? And this is under Obama. People started paying a little bit more in taxes. You will hear a lot of debate in the upcoming election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. He made it. He did it. He did it. You will hear a lot. Hey, I think the only good thing that will come out of this Republican primary is we now get to see where Donald Trump goes with his rhetoric. What he's going to sound like now that he's running for a national election rather than Republicans. But anyway, please keep your ears open to those on Hillary Clinton's side of the aisle that advocate for raising taxes on the wealthiest Americans while keeping taxes stagnant for the majority of the rest. Or Donald Trump, who I don't know his platform or policy yet, because I'm not sure he does yet, but is more so going to advocate for probably decreasing taxes, certainly on the highest. Now, make sure you are recognizing this, guys. If every single American has their marginal tax rate decreased by 5%, every single American will pay less taxes. But if you decrease $1,000 by 5%, what is that?
$50.
Very good. So someone that pays $1,000 in federal income taxes, they're not a very high earner. They pay $1,000 in federal income taxes, they're going to get $50 more at the end of the year in their pockets. Nice. Someone that makes $1 million a year, how much extra money are they going to have?
$5,000.
What's that?
$5,000 extra dollars.
$5,000 extra dollars? Is that it?
No, $50,000. My bad.
Yeah, I think we got to have an extra zero. So the millionaire, even though his tax rate might decrease by the same percentage, is certainly like now he doesn't have like an extra dinner at Olive Garden. He has an extra car in his driveway, and that's where some people see a problem or see why some people would argue that the wealthiest deserve or should pay more because they have more. This is a debate we're not going to have today, but it is a debate our nation will be having. The point is here, by the time we get to the late 20th century, President like Ronald Reagan and George Bush after him and Bill Clinton after him and George Bush after him, different George Bushes, Bush 41, Bush 43. Barack Obama largely after him, he didn't increase taxes that much comparatively, have generally started to retract the size of the government compared to what it was before. Now, Obama's administration started to push a little back with the development of the Obamacare medical legislation and whatnot. But you won't be asked about that because that's too new. That's not even history. That's like news story. We see a similar thing in China. In China, that's still Ronald Reagan. When the United States is getting Ronald Reagan making the federal government pull back from its regulation on industry and from its high taxation, in China, a new leader in the late 70s and into the 1980s, his name is Deng Xiaoping. You guys would say Deng. That's his family name, his given name. Deng Xiaoping will be the leader of China. Now, Deng Xiaoping doesn't want to give up any of the harsh political control that the Chinese Communist Party has. But he's absolutely going to move to what we would say liberalize the Chinese economy, to allow Western industry and foreign industry to enter into China. With some oversight from the government still, absolutely. But this kind of stuff didn't exist under Mao Zedong in earlier decades. Deng Xiaoping will reform the Chinese economy to make it to what is today the largest economy in the world, right? Not per capita. They have so many people, they're still relatively poor per capita. But their production is amongst the biggest economies in the world. And today, if you guys were to go to Beijing, you could go have breakfast at McDonald's and lunch at Taco Bell and dinner in Kentucky Fried Chicken, all while being driven around in an Uber car driven that is driving a Buick. All right? What's that? It is a Buick. It just doesn't look like it anymore, right? Can't tell. All right. So good? Good. So hey, here's a similarity, right? A similarity. Both China and the United States in the mid-20th century, in reaction to economic problems, moved to have their governments take more control over the economy. Certainly China far more extreme. And then by the late 20th century, both governments, in their own way, were removing some of those government controls. All right? Sweet. All right, we press on. Now we're on to 632. We will see new international bodies trying to keep the peace around the world, because certainly in the 20th century, there's a lot of violence. So maybe we should put something together that attempts to maintain international security. The first attempt at it, which is an absolute fail, is the League of Nations. The League of Nations is born after World War I, and it is set up for failure from the very start. One major reason is the United States does not join it. Even though our president came up with the idea, President Woodrow Wilson had the idea for the League of Nations, because of our Constitution, the Senate has to approve treaties. And the League of Nations was in the Treaty of Versailles. We never approved it. The Senate never ratified it, because we didn't want to get dragged into European problems, because we had an ocean that separated us from Europe. So the League of Nations starts off on a bad foot. And then they also have no real ability to enforce any of its orders. So by the 1930s, as we've already talked about, countries like Japan and Italy and then Germany will prove that the League of Nations is weak. So we get a do-over, we get a mulligan, we try again. And after World War II, we put together the United Nations. Now here's a dramatic change in American policy in the 20th century. After World War I, we didn't want anything to do with European problems. After World War II, we recognized that the world has changed. The world is much smaller. The Atlantic Ocean can't protect us anymore, and that we need to be involved in European issues and global issues. So we are not only a founding member of the United Nations, we are one of the most important member nations of this international body. And that exists still to this day. So both the League of Nations and the United Nations are meant to help avoid international crises and give a forum for discussions and give a body that could stop international situations from happening. The first one fails. The second one has been more successful with some issues still. One important note. When the United, you don't have to memorize this, just hear it. When the United Nations was born, 5 countries were given special seats, important positions within the United Nations. It's called the United Nations Security Council. If the UN is going to use military force, it's coming through a vote in the United Nations Security Council. There's 5 countries in it. Let's take a stab if you can come up with them. Yes?
United States.
United States is one.
England.
Yes. Great Britain is 2. Yes. France is 3.
No.
Germany.
No.
No.
It was set up to control Germany.
Yes. Soviet Union is 4. Yes.
No, the Taiwan, China.
Okay, wait, no. It's China in 1945. But here's an important story, and all your pencils are down. You're not writing this because you almost out of paper for your World War II notebook, or your AP World notebook. Shh. So here's how crazy the United Nations gets. Here's how crazy the United Nations gets. When the Security Council is born, it is agreed that those 5 nations of the Security Council, no matter what happens in the world going forward, those 5 nations will be permanent members of the Security Council. There are other rotating members that get to come onto the Security Council, get to vote, and they get to hang out for a few years, and then they're booted back out. But those 5 countries are permanent members of the Security Council. And not only are they permanent, they also have veto power. So if 4 of the permanent members want to do something, but 1 doesn't, it's squashed. So you can imagine, as World War II quickly evolves into the Cold War, and the United States and the Soviet Union are both permanent members of the Security Council with veto power, we can absolutely see how the United Nations itself might not get much done. Because things that the Soviet Union likes, America might not like. Things that the Americans like, the Soviets may not like. Except for one important instance, which this is, I think, why I read very little fiction. I only read a lot of history stuff. Because I think truth is sometimes stranger than fiction. Like the stuff that really happens can rarely be thought up in people's imaginations to work out as perfectly or as oddly as it does. In 1949, you're not writing, you're just listening. In 1949, China becomes communist. Stop writing. In 1949, China becomes communist. Well, the China that the United States wanted on the Security Council was the Chinese Republic, was a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, had nothing to do with communism. We didn't like communism. But then Chiang Kai-shek lost the Chinese Civil War to Mao Zedong. So the United States said, no, we didn't put Mao Zedong's China, communist China, on the Security Council. We put Chiang Kai-shek's China on the Security Council. And Chiang Kai-shek's China is now taken refuge on the little island of Taiwan, off the coast of China. And so in 1949, we said, that is the China that has the seat on the Security Council. Not the big China with hundreds of millions of people led by Mao Zedong. In protest of this movement, the Soviet Union said, well, fine, we're taking our marbles and we're going home. We're quitting. We're going to boycott the United Nations Security Council. It just so happened in the next year, in 1950, communist North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States took it to the Security Council. We got to do something about this. This is what the United Nations is here for, to stop countries from invading other countries. Security Council vote. How do we all vote on this? United States? Yes, let's stop North Korea. France? We. England? Yeah. Aye, yes. Oi, oi, yeah, whatever they're saying. China. China, what say you? Not communist China, Chiang Kai-shek China. Yes. Absolutely they're going to say yes because they want America on their side. Soviet Union, what say you? Crickets. Nothing. Soviet Union's not there. They boycotted it. That's why Korea is a United Nations war. All right? It's not just an American war, it's a United Nations war. Now, eventually the Soviet Union comes back to the Security Council. And eventually, by the 1970s, when the United States is trying to get out of the Vietnam War and trying to have a better relationship with China, the Americans will let Communist China actually have that Security Council seat again. What happened to Taiwan? So, they're still there, and we still kind of look out for them. But
they're not on the Security
they're not a Security Council nation anymore. Nope.
Wait, is Russia a security?
Absolutely.
What
Absolutely.
happened when in 1991 when US just turned into Russia?
Okay, we press on, guys. Shh. In addition to these international peacekeeping organizations, there are a handful of international economic organizations. We're not going to talk about any of them in depth. I just want you to be aware of their existence. The International Monetary Fund. Hey, guess what? It kind of oversees issues of international monies, like exchanges rates and such, trying to avoid situations of hyperinflation, for example. The International Monetary Fund the World Bank, which says it's meant to support and try to support developing nations to try to limit poverty in those nations. But they also only act when it's in the best interest of increasing foreign trade. All right? So the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is the largest global collection of nations who meet with each other to try to ease trade restrictions between nations. So in addition to the peacekeeping organizations like the League of Nations that failed and the UN that's been marginally more successful, there are international financial and economic organizations trying to... So what are we seeing in the world? Remember the nationalism of the 19th and the early 20th century where countries really stayed on their own? What's happening now?
Globalization.
Globalization. We're all coming back together. Internationalization. Very good, very good, very good.
What does the World Trade Organization do?
It tries to make world trade easier. All right. A couple examples of trade agreements within regions that you should be aware of. Now, please understand this. Trade has happened from the first time that, that human beings have started growing stuff. Right? As soon as we started producing agricultural surpluses, we've been trading. We're typically trading with people next to us, right? With people in our community. And over human history, we've always worked at ways to facilitate that trade, to make that trade a little easier. Can you guys think of ways that society, civilizations have worked to facilitate trade?
The Silk Road.
Very good. The Silk Road. And then the Mongol paving of the Silk Road, let's call it. They made it nicer. They made it safer. Absolutely. Okay, the caravanserais that were created through the Sahara and through the deserts of the Middle East to give way stations for travelers. Absolutely, yes.
The water canal and so on.
Very good. Digging the Grand Canal from the Yangtze River in the north to the Yangtze River in the south. Very good. So we got all kinds of examples of it. Paper money, flying money in China, right? The coining of money beginning, going all the way back to the Lydians of your discussion probably last year, chapter 1 of the book. So we've always done things to do what's called ease trade barriers. A trade barrier is anything that slows down trade between two individuals. Well, by the 20th century, the greatest trade barriers that exist are often self-imposed, right? Like, what's a self-imposed trade barrier? Yes?
Embargo.
An embargo. We are literally not buying stuff from Cuba. We're gonna not sell stuff to them either. Embargoes and boycotts. Those are trade barriers. Yes.
Tariffs.
Tariffs. I'm going to put a tax on goods that are imported into my country. That's a trade barrier because that makes it more expensive for foreign countries to sell stuff in my country. And then if we start putting tariffs, like we saw with the Great Depression, if we start levying tariffs on imported goods, what will other countries do? The exact same. They're increasing trade barriers. So that's a huge one. Quotas, right? Not only allowing a certain number of Japanese cars to enter into a marketplace. That is a trade barrier. So, yes, ma'am. Other isolationist policies, sure, that a country might come up with. That could be a trade barrier. In the last couple decades of the 20th century, we see the work of global trade agreements trying to limit those barriers. The European Union is probably one that you're more familiar with. The European Union is an economic relationship between many European countries where they would agree to limit trade barriers between them. And trade barriers could be issues of currency. Many countries in the European Union now use what instead of their traditional currency?
Euro.
They use a euro. So you don't have, if you go from France to Germany, you don't have to exchange your money.
Except for the
Right?
United Kingdom.
United Kingdom stayed out of that, right? But there's a lot of debate whether they should join in or not, right?
I think
So
they believe this.
they're, with what's going on in Europe right now, they're probably staying out of it for much longer. But the limiting of tariffs between countries and quotas between countries, that's what the European Union is most about. In North America, we have our own trade agreement, which you will absolutely hear this. You're already hearing it a lot. And here's what's kind of wild about Donald Trump, now the Republican nominee, is the Republican Party has traditionally been a strong supporter of limiting trade barriers, making trade more free around the world. Well, in the 1990s, President Bill Clinton signed into law, Bill Clinton signed into law, which was supported by a Republican Congress, what is called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that eliminated trade barriers between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And you are absolutely going to hear a lot about NAFTA in this presidential election. Well, you heard a lot about it in the debates, but you'll hear more in this presidential election, because as soon as NAFTA existed, where did General Motors and Ford and Chrysler start building cars?
Mexico.
In Mexico. In Mexico. Taking our jobs, right? And now we got to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it, right? So we see again, what is NAFTA and what is the European Union? Guys, continuity and change over time. Early 20th century, nationalism. The French building the Maginot Line along their border with Germany. Now the European Union eliminates all of these walls between countries, all right? And it is only modern American presidential candidates that want to build more of them, all right? We also see in the late 20th century, companies, multinational companies. Companies that might, like, does anybody know where Shell is from?
Indonesia.
Huh? It's a Dutch company. It's a Dutch company. And then the Dutch used to control Indonesia, so they got a lot of interest in Indonesia. But it's a multinational company. Now, every single place you see like a red or yellow square on this map, that is where Shell is either producing or refining oil. All right? And Vietnam is there, as is Michigan. They got operations in Michigan. So this is a new question in the modern economy. As the world has become more globalized, so have companies around the world. Companies that might have started in the Netherlands, or companies that might have started in Atlanta, Georgia, are now multinational. Coca-Cola makes far more money outside of the United States than it makes inside the United States. So here's the question. To whom does Coca-Cola owe tax dollars to?
America.
It's a big, where are they making their money? And are they keeping it in offshore? Are they starting up businesses in foreign countries like Ireland, for example, that virtually eliminates foreign business taxes, or business taxes? So these are questions that the world deals with today as new companies become more wealthy, more powerful, and start to try to avoid government oversight. And in fact, in the United States, what do a lot of companies try to do to try to have the government be a little bit more friendly to them?
Avoid taxes.
They give money. They give money to campaigns, right? And the U.S. Supreme Court has essentially said that American corporations are the same as American individuals and have the same rights to give campaign donations to anybody that they please, just as American individuals might do. One other international movement, this time to try to bring more oversight around the world to environmental issues, is an organization like Greenpeace. Now, in the United States, please recognize that we have pretty strict environmental regulations for manufacturing in the United States. Ever since new laws of the 1970s came around, like the Clean Water Act and such, the Clean Air Acts, you're not allowed to just dump crap into our lakes and rivers anymore. But some foreign nations, they don't have the same kind of oversight. So American companies can produce far more cheaply overseas, not just because they can pay workers less, but because there aren't the same environmental regulations. A group like Greenpeace tries to bring the world's vision to that kind of issue, all right? Almost done. We're getting there. People in the late 20th century are going to begin to view society and culture in different ways. Now, one coming out of the new United Nations is the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The United Nations in 1948 agreed to a list of principles that every human being, wherever they are, should enjoy. Now, we, of course, know that every human being, no matter where they are, doesn't enjoy all of the principles of human rights that we would think should be commonplace. But at least the world has come up with an agreed set of principles that we should strive to. All right? And this is where modern issues like the status of refugees becomes a question. Because the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, upon which we have agreed to, and later declarations on refugees that we have agreed to, have said, we agree to look out and support the plight of refugees fleeing their homes because of violence or other safety concerns. Well, now this becomes a political football as there are questions over how many or who we should be allowing to come into our country based on principles like this. We will see in the late 20th century new ideas of culture and reactions in societies to other cultures that people might not be as comfortable with as their societies start to change. The College Board wants you to be familiar with this term, negritude. This is born out of the French colonies in Africa in the 1930s. It was a literary and philosophical movement where French colonial subjects argued, the black Africans of the French colonies in Africa, argued for their own independence. And this gets linked up with the Pan-African movement we already talked about. But that the colonial overseers should be driven out and Africans themselves should stand together. Remember when we talked, and you guys heard it again at Wayne State. One second here. You heard it again at Wayne State. When someone says, well, Africans are enslaving other Africans. Why would they do that to themselves? They weren't doing it to themselves. They were enslaving people that maybe spoke different languages and had different cultures and different religious beliefs. They were different people. But only outsiders viewed them as all the same. But by the 20th century, in a push to drive out people like the French, black Africans who previously had very little in common with each other started to stand in greater solidarity. So we get the negritude movement, we get the Pan-African movement, where Africans who previously had very little in common now had a common drive to get the outsiders out. Guys, give me 2 more minutes and I will get to your question, okay? We will see an increase in xenophobia in many communities, and this is continuing to this day. And certainly we hear it in our own presidential election in the rhetoric that we hear now. That America is changing, that outsiders are changing our culture or changing who we are, or they're not becoming like us. While the xenophobic reactions to outsiders, whether they come from the Middle East or from Latin America into the United States today, is really not that different from the xenophobia that we would see on the rise in the earlier 20th century in the drive to eliminate Chinese immigration or Japanese immigration into the United States. In addition to movements like this from native populations, I shouldn't use that word, because they weren't, from white folks. Okay, let's just call them white folks. So not natives. In addition to reactions like this, by the late 20th century, we're going to see violent reactions from especially African American communities in many American cities to the racial disparity in the United States, to the income inequality, to the educational differences, to the institutionalized racism of American society. This is a picture of Detroit, Michigan in 1967, when National Guard troops were called in to quell the Detroit riots. As Detroiters were protesting their conditions, their treatment by an almost all-white police force in the 1960s. And you'll see race riots in Detroit and in Newark and in Los Angeles and many other American cities in the 1960s. A lot of bad news when you talk about world history. Let's close with a couple positives. Popular, among other things, popular culture will become globalized. Sports. Sports becomes more widely practiced around the world, more widely viewed around the world, and becomes a source for both nationalistic pride, like here we see some very excited Germans about winning the World Cup, and also a sense of internationalism with the Olympic Games that are born in 1896, but will grow throughout the 20th century. All right? And then finally, and here's where we're going to bring it full circle. We talked about how going back to last year when you guys studied the River Valley civilizations, and there was the Indus River Valley civilization. And then we studied in classical India the Mauryan dynasty and the Gupta dynasty. And then we talked about how India would experience the Delhi Sultanate amidst other division within South Asia. And then we talked about the rise of the Mughal dynasty, and then the British wanting control of India and exploiting India for their cotton production, right? And then we talked about Mohandas Gandhi and the push for Indian self-rule, and that Indians should produce for Indians again, right? And India in 1947 ultimately gains its independence and begins to establish itself not as a purely independent Indian state anymore, but as an Indian state with outside ideas. India today is the largest democracy on the planet. The largest democracy on the planet, right? And today, Bollywood in India, with the spreading of American culture, American Hollywood culture around the planet, Bollywood in India today produces more films and sells more tickets to their movies than Hollywood does. Now, Hollywood still got the worldwide blockbusters. They're still making a little bit more money. Indian people watch Hollywood blockbusters. Most Americans don't watch Indian blockbusters, all right? But they're growing, and they're growing fast, all right? And I think this is a good way to end this class. It's a good way to end AP World History. It's a good way to recognize the dramatic changes that human societies have gone through. To close us out with a little Bollywood dance. If you want to dance along, you go for it.
Pride and Prejudice? Pride and Prejudice?
I don't know this movie. Do you guys know this one? Is it a good one? She's on Game of Thrones. She's causing problems in Game of Thrones. Yeah, it was. That's totally her. We're going to look her up on IMDb after lunch. You guys are allowed to go to lunch. You take. There we go. You guys are allowed to go to lunch. You don't want to leave AP World. You want to just keep it going. She is totally. She just killed her husband. Hey, spoiler! Oh, you guys haven't watched this week's yet?
No, I'm sorry.
Wait, that was last week. My bad. All right, get out. I'm gonna go to lunch.
Oh, wait, it's still on. Hey.
Is this how an Indian wedding really goes down?
No. North Indian wedding. Really? Because everybody just sing weddings are boring.
Whoa. What's going on here? Hey, good looking. But yeah, that's like a white guy, right? Okay. All right.
That was pretty intense, but chicken and waffles are being served today, so.
Good stuff.